The collapse of the Japanese Empire on August 15, 1945 ended a 35-year colonial presence in Korea, but left no prearranged system for governing the peninsula. Japanese rule had centralized administration, police authority, and economic assets. When that structure disappeared, Korea lacked a unified political body capable of taking control. The Allied powers, focused on ending the Second World War, had not prepared a long-term framework for Korean independence. In the final days of the conflict, United States officials proposed dividing the peninsula at the 38th parallel to facilitate an orderly Japanese surrender. The Soviet Union agreed to the proposal, accepting responsibility for the area north of the line, while the United States assumed control of the south. Soviet forces entered northern Korea in late August 1945. Their arrival was followed by the entry of United States troops in the south when American occupation forces landed at Inchon on September 8, 1945. This was an administrative occupation landing, not an amphibious combat landing like the later Inchon operation of 1950. From the outset, the two zones developed under different political, administrative, and military conditions. In the northern zone, Soviet officers encountered local steering committees that had formed spontaneously after the Japanese withdrawal. These groups represented a range of ideological tendencies, but often leaned toward left-wing politics because anti-colonial movements had been repressed during the Japanese occupation. Soviet authorities quickly recognized the usefulness of these committees and reorganized them into a more structured system known as the Provisional People's Committees. Among the Korean Communist figures who became central to northern political consolidation was Kim Il-sung, who had served with anti-Japanese guerrilla forces in Manchuria and later in Soviet-supported units. One of the most significant early reforms in the North was the implementation of land redistribution in March 1946. Japanese-owned land, property of Korean collaborators, and large landlord holdings were confiscated and redistributed to approximately 700,000 peasant households. This restructuring dismantled the pre-colonial landlord system and reshaped northern Korea's agrarian economy. Soviet advisors played a direct role in planning and executing the reforms, which were followed by the nationalization of major industries and the reorganization of political institutions. By mid-1946, the provisional government systems were functioning under strong Soviet guidance. The Korean Workers' Party, KWP, emerged as the dominant political organization in the North. It was formed through a series of mergers, culminating in June 1949, when Northern and Southern Communist parties consolidated into a single entity. While Soviet occupation troops began withdrawing in late 1948, their withdrawal applied mainly to combat units. Military advisors, political consultants, intelligence officers, and technical specialists continued operating in the DPRK afterward. Equipment transfers, training programs, and political coordination remained ongoing. The situation in the southern zone developed along a different trajectory. The United States Army military government in Korea, Yesamjik, administered the South from September 1945 to August 1948. Facing administrative gaps and limited Korean governmental infrastructure, United States officials retained much of the Japanese-era police and bureaucratic apparatus to maintain order. This decision caused political friction because many Koreans associated those institutions with colonial oppression. From the American perspective, these structures were necessary to restore essential services and stabilize the region while Korean political groups developed. The United States encouraged the formation of security forces, beginning with the Korean Constabulary in 1946. This organization later evolved into the core of the Republic of Korea Army, ROKA. United States troop presence gradually reduced after 1945, roughly 25,000 personnel in late 1945, decreasing to around 7,500 to 8,000 in 1948. By mid-1949, only 500 to 1,500 American advisors and security staff remained. This decline reflected American efforts to reduce overseas commitments after the war and shift responsibility to the emerging Korean government. Efforts to create a unified Korea through negotiation broke down early. The United States Soviet Joint Commission met in 1946 and 1947, but failed to agree on which political groups could participate in forming a national government. The Soviet Union insisted on excluding anti-communist organizations, while the United States rejected any ideological restrictions. With no progress, the United States referred the issue to the United Nations. In November 1947, the UN General Assembly authorized supervised elections across the entire peninsula through the UN Temporary Commission on Korea, (UNCOC). The Soviet Union barred UN observers from entering the North, arguing that elections supervised by outside powers violated Korean sovereignty. As a result, UNCOC conducted elections only in the southern zone on May 10, 1948. The Commission declared the elections valid in the areas accessible, acknowledging limited jurisdiction. A National Assembly was elected in the South, and it adopted a constitution on July 17, 1948. On August 15, 1948, the Republic of Korea, ROK, was established with Syngman Rhee as its first president. In response, Northern authorities formalized the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, on September 9, 1948, with Kim Il-sung as premier. Both governments claimed to be the sole legitimate government of Korea. The ROK based its claim on UN authorization. The DPRK argued that the elections were invalid because the UN could not enter the entire peninsula, and because the Soviet Union maintained that Koreans should determine their political future without external interference. Post-Cold War archival releases confirm that both sides engaged in offensive probes, and neither accepted the division as final. Events outside Korea also shaped the peninsula's political future. The establishment of the People's Republic of China, PRC, in October 1949, and the signing of the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance on February 14, 1950 altered the strategic balance in East Asia. Although Soviet influence in the DPRK remained primary during 1946 to 49, the PRC quickly became an important partner after its founding. The communist victory in China also shifted the United States' strategic calculations, leading officials in Washington to reassess commitments in the region. Kim Il-sung repeatedly sought approval from Joseph Stalin for military action to unify Korea. Archival evidence indicates that Stalin was cautious in 1949, concerned about possible United States intervention. By spring 1950, he signaled conditional approval for limited DPRK operations and authorized weapons transfers. Historians debate the precise date on which full approval for a large-scale invasion was granted. Most place it between April and May 1950, with the condition that China would intervene if the United States entered the war. Mao Zedong agreed to this arrangement, creating a strategic framework for North Korea to plan a major offensive. Meanwhile, the United States was reassessing its global security posture in response to perceived Soviet expansion. The completion of NSC 68 in April 1950 recommended significantly strengthening the United States' military capabilities worldwide. Although NSC 68 had not yet been adopted, it reflected an emerging consensus that the United States should resist communist expansion. Public statements by American officials in early 1950 described a defensive perimeter in East Asia that did not explicitly include Korea. This omission was noted by policymakers in Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang. Internal conditions in Korea remained unstable. In the South, the Rhee government faced political unrest, including the Jeju Uprising of 1948–49, which required extensive police and military intervention. Casualty estimates vary, but investigations conducted decades later documented large-scale loss of life. These internal conflicts strained ROKA resources and demonstrated the challenges of consolidating authority. In the North, the DPRK continued restructuring land ownership, reorganizing industry under state control, and strengthening political institutions through the Korean Workers' Party with sustained Soviet guidance. By early 1950, the division of Korea had solidified into two governments with competing claims of legitimacy, each supported by different external powers. Both had developed military forces capable of sustained operations. Diplomatic negotiations had collapsed, and there was no functioning mechanism to reduce tensions or resolve territorial disputes. The border remained militarized and unstable. The geopolitical environment had shifted in favor of the DPRK, which now had support from both the Soviet Union and the newly formed PRC. The United States continued supporting the ROK, but maintained a limited troop presence and offered no explicit defense guarantee. By early 1950, the Korean peninsula remained divided between two states that had emerged from the diplomatic failures and political developments of the previous 5 years. The Republic of Korea, ROK, governed the southern half under President Syngman Rhee, while the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, under Kim Il-sung administered the north with Soviet backing. Both governments claimed exclusive sovereignty over the peninsula. Although border clashes, political tensions, and military buildup indicated a volatile environment, intelligence organizations and policymakers in Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo did not anticipate a coordinated DPRK offensive. This miscalculation influenced the conditions under which the Korean War began. From a strategic perspective, the United States entered 1950 focused primarily on Europe and the broader problem of Soviet expansion. The emerging Cold War had shaped American priorities, with Western Europe receiving the largest share of military, diplomatic, and economic attention. In East Asia, Japan held greater strategic significance for United States policy planners than Korea. The United States continued reducing its post-Second World War deployments, maintaining only small advisory units in Korea while concentrating on Japan's reconstruction and political stabilization. This regional context shifted significantly after the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, emerged victorious in the Chinese Civil War and established the People's Republic of China, PRC, on October 1, 1949. The PRC's creation altered the balance of power in East Asia. Its alignment with the Soviet Union was formalized through the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance, signed on February 14, 1950. The treaty provided military and political assurances between the two states, reinforcing the cohesion of the communist bloc in Asia. Despite these developments, American strategic planning continued to treat Korea as a peripheral theater rather than a central arena of Cold War competition. The United States completed NSC 68 in April 1950, a comprehensive report assessing global security conditions and recommending significant increases in United States defense spending. NSC 68 described a world divided between two competing systems and advocated strengthening the United States military capabilities. However, NSC 68 remained a proposal rather than an implemented policy in early 1950. Budget constraints, political debates, and competing priorities meant its recommendations had not yet translated into concrete military deployments or planning adjustments. Korea, therefore, did not receive increased attention or reinforcement even as the DPRK accelerated its military buildup. Public statements by United States government officials further contributed to the misunderstanding. In January 1950, Secretary of State Dean Acheson outlined the American defensive perimeter in the Pacific, focusing on Japan, the Ryukyu Islands, and the Philippines. Korea was not explicitly included, although Acheson later clarified that the United States remained committed to supporting the ROK. The omission influenced perceptions in Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang. It contributed to the belief among communist leaders that United States intervention in Korea was uncertain. American intelligence agencies monitored developments on the peninsula. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, the State Department's Intelligence Division, and United States Army intelligence units produced regular assessments. These reports acknowledged DPRK military growth, but did not anticipate a coordinated attack. Analysts cited the lack of evidence for sudden troop concentration, the absence of clear indicators of offensive planning, and the assumption that the Soviet Union would avoid provoking the United States. Many reports concluded that DPRK actions remained consistent with defensive preparations and routine training cycles. Information about the DPRK was limited. The closed nature of the northern state, combined with restricted access to Soviet and Chinese sources, left intelligence agencies reliant on indirect information. Aerial reconnaissance was constrained by geography, weather conditions, and limited range. Human intelligence networks inside the DPRK were minimal. Reports from Seoul and ROK military units provided valuable information, but often lacked detail or corroboration. As a result, intelligence assessments frequently reflected uncertainty rather than a clear warning. In Tokyo, the United States Far East Command under General Douglas MacArthur evaluated the situation using its own intelligence resources. Far East Command reports acknowledged improvements in DPRK military capability, including the introduction of T-34-85 tanks, increased artillery strength, and the organization of new infantry formations. However, these reports often judged that the DPRK could not sustain large-scale operations without Soviet or Chinese direct involvement. The emphasis on ROK internal instability also influenced assessments. ROK political challenges, including regional unrest, economic difficulties, and police operations tied to internal security, appeared to dominate the southern security landscape. This framing led analysts to conclude that internal issues posed a greater immediate threat to ROK stability than external aggression. The ROK leadership interpreted events differently. President Ri consistently warned American officials that the DPRK intended to launch a major offensive. His requests for increased military support reflected concerns about the imbalance between ROK and DPRK capabilities. By early 1950, the ROK Army numbered approximately 95,000 to 98,000 personnel, although only a fraction were trained and equipped for conventional field operations. Many units focused on internal security roles, particularly in response to uprisings and political unrest during 1948 to 49. The United States had supplied rifles, light artillery, and transport equipment, but had withheld tanks, heavy artillery, and aircraft out of concern that the ROK might attempt an offensive northward. DPRK military development proceeded under Soviet guidance. Between 1949 and early 1950, the KPA expanded to an estimated 115,000 to 135,000 active personnel, supported by reserves and paramilitary formations. Soviet assistance included weapons shipments, technical training, and staff planning. The DPRK received T-34-85 tanks, artillery systems, mortars, trucks, communications equipment, and small arms. Soviet advisors helped organize the KPA into divisions capable of coordinated operations. Although the DPRK exercised formal command authority, Soviet officers played a substantial role in preparing KPA units for combined arms operations. Border conditions during the early 1950s continued the pattern established in previous years. Dozens of incidents occurred along the 38th parallel during the first quarter alone, reflecting reconnaissance operations, patrol clashes, and occasional exchanges of fire. Archival sources vary on precise numbers because reporting standards differed between the ROK, DPRK, and foreign observers. United States and ROK units monitored increased DPRK activity, but analysts interpreted the incidents as part of the long-standing unstable environment rather than as evidence of imminent offensive preparations. Inside the DPRK, the leadership continued coordinating with the Soviet Union and the PRC. Soviet archival documents indicate that in 1949, Joseph Stalin expressed hesitation about approving a DPRK attack because of concerns about United States involvement. Discussions between Stalin and Kim Il-sung continued over the next year. By spring 1950, Stalin provided conditional approval for offensive planning, contingent upon Chinese support if the United States intervened. Mao Zedong agreed to this arrangement. These diplomatic assurances created a strategic environment in which DPRK leaders believed they could pursue unification through military action with manageable risks. Between February and June 1950, DPRK forces increased training and refined operational plans. KPA infantry divisions conducted joint exercises with armored and artillery units. Communications networks were expanded, and logistics preparations were made for sustained offensive operations. Soviet advisors assisted with planning, but did not assume direct command roles. The DPRK leadership intended to conduct a rapid, coordinated assault designed to overwhelm ROK defenses before external intervention could occur. Although some of these movements were detected by intelligence units in the south, the assessments produced did not indicate imminent attack. Analysts noted increased activity but interpreted it through existing assumptions, viewing the developments as defensive measures or training cycles. The absence of sudden troop surges or highly visible mobilization reduced the perceived threat level. Multiple strategic assumptions shaped the United States and the ROK's interpretation of events. 1. Soviet caution. Policymakers believed the Soviet Union would avoid actions that risked confrontation with the United States. This assumption did not account for Soviet expectations of rapid DPRK success. 2. Limits of DPRK capability. Analysts acknowledged DPRK strength, but believed the ROK could delay an attack long enough for United States forces to intervene. This underestimated the operational advantage provided by DPRK armor and training. 3. Chinese priorities. United States intelligence believed China would avoid external conflict while consolidating its new government. This misjudged China's willingness to support DPRK actions under the framework of the Sino-Soviet alliance. 4. Incomplete intelligence. The limited availability of reliable information about the DPRK prevented accurate threat assessment. 5. Normalization of border violence. Years of skirmishes created a perception that ongoing incidents represented continuity rather than escalation. 6. Misinterpretation of DPRK decision-making. Intelligence assessments often assumed DPRK policy would closely follow Soviet directives, underestimating the extent of Kim Il-sung's advocacy for an offensive. These combined factors produced a strategic environment in which a major attack appeared unlikely to foreign observers, even as the DPRK completed preparations. By June 1950, DPRK forces had positioned themselves for coordinated offensive operations along multiple axes. Infantry divisions, armored brigades, and artillery regiments stood ready to advance. Communications and logistics systems were prepared to support rapid movement. Despite these developments, United States intelligence summaries published shortly before the invasion described the situation as tense but stable. The conditions for a strategic surprise were fully in place. The DPRK leadership, confident in Soviet support and reassured by Chinese willingness to intervene, prepared to launch its offensive. The United States and the ROK, relying on incomplete information and flawed assumptions, did not anticipate a coordinated multi-division assault. On June 25, 1950, the DPRK launched a full-scale invasion across the 38th parallel. The attack exceeded the scale, coordination, and intensity anticipated by any intelligence assessment, marking the failure of diplomatic judgment and intelligence interpretation that characterized the early 1950s. By late June 1950, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, completed its final preparations for a coordinated offensive aimed at unifying the peninsula. The Republic of Korea, ROK, remained under-equipped, dispersed across a broad defensive line, and operating under strategic assumptions that did not anticipate a mechanized assault. Intelligence failures, misinterpretations of DPRK intentions, and the cumulative effect of years of intermittent border incidents contributed to a situation in which the DPRK's preparations went largely unrecognized. When the attack commenced on June 25, 1950, It marked the beginning of a rapid shift in the balance of control on the peninsula. In the days leading up to the invasion, the DPRK completed final troop movements into assault positions along the 38th parallel. These forces were organized into multiple infantry divisions, armored brigades, and supporting artillery units. Estimates vary by archival source, but most assessments place 7 KPA infantry divisions, supported by at least one armored brigade, as primary assault elements. The KPA possessed approximately 150 to 200 T-34-85 tanks, which represented a decisive advantage over the ROK Army, which had no tanks and limited anti-armor capability. Soviet advisors had assisted the DPRK General Staff in operational planning during early 1950, although the DPRK retained formal command authority. Communications networks linking forward divisions to headquarters were prepared to coordinate movement along multiple axes. At approximately 0400 hours on June 25, 1950, the DPRK initiated a general offensive across the 38th parallel. The attack began with concentrated artillery fire along several sectors, including the Ongjin Peninsula, the Kaesong, Seoul Corridor, and the Central and Eastern Fronts. Artillery bombardment served to disrupt ROK defensive positions and communications. Following the initial bombardment, KPA armored units and infantry advanced across the line in coordinated formations. The use of armor allowed the DPRK to break through thinly defended ROK positions, many of which were occupied by understrength or lightly armed units. The ROK Army at this time consisted of approximately 95,000 to 98,000 personnel, although only a portion were assigned to frontline combat units. Many ROK units were deployed in company or battalion-sized elements along extended sections of the border. The ROK possessed limited artillery, no tanks, and no anti-tank guns capable of defeating T-34 armor. The ROK Air Force had a small number of liaison and training aircraft, but no combat-capable fighters or bombers. As a result, the ROK Army entered the conflict at a significant disadvantage in mobility, firepower, and defensive depth. Initial DPRK advances achieved rapid progress. On the Ongjin Peninsula, DPRK infantry and armored units overwhelmed ROK defensive positions within hours, forcing withdrawals toward more defensible terrain. In the central sector, KPA forces advanced toward Wejongbu, a key route leading directly to Seoul. KPA armored spearheads exploited gaps between ROK units, bypassing strong points and enveloping forward positions. Reports from ROK field commanders during the morning of June 25 indicated that several units had been cut off or forced to withdraw due to the combination of infantry assaults and armored breakthroughs. Communication difficulties compounded the challenges facing the ROK. The initial artillery bombardment damaged the communications infrastructure, and ROK headquarters received fragmented reports about the scale and direction of DPRK advances. In some sectors, commanders believed initially that the assaults were localized incidents rather than part of a coordinated offensive. The rapid movement of DPRK armored units soon made clear, however, that the attack was a general offensive aimed at penetrating multiple sections of the line simultaneously. By midday on June 25th, the ROK government informed the United States of the scale of the attack. United States officials in Seoul, including members of the United States Military Advisory Group to Korea, KMAG, confirmed that large-scale fighting was underway along the 38th parallel. Reports from the field indicated that DPRK forces were advancing in several sectors and that ROK defenses were under severe pressure. The rapidity of DPRK progress, combined with the inability of ROK forces to contain armored spearheads, led to concerns that the KPA could achieve significant territorial gains in a short period of time. The international response began the same day. Because the Soviet Union was boycotting the United Nations Security Council over the representation of China, the council met without Soviet participation. On June 25, 1950, the Security Council adopted Resolution 82, which called for the immediate cessation of hostilities and the withdrawal of DPRK forces to the 38th parallel. Compliance did not occur, and DPRK advances continued. On the ground, ROK forces attempted to regroup and establish defensive positions along key terrain features and transportation routes. The Huizhongbu corridor, which provided the most direct route to Seoul, became a focal point for ROK efforts to delay the KPA. However, ROK units lacked the anti-tank weapons necessary to halt armored advances. Infantry units attempted to use small arms, grenades, and improvised obstacles, but these measures proved insufficient. KPA units continued to move southward, supported by artillery and coordinated infantry assaults. The speed of the DPRK advance reflected both the strength of KPA planning and the structural weaknesses described in segments 1 and 2. ROK forces were not configured for large-scale, mechanized warfare. Their training had emphasized internal security, constabulary operations, and small unit tactics rather than combined arms defense. The ROK's geographic deployment, with units stretched thin across the length of the border, left few reserves available to reinforce failing sectors. As DPRK spearheads advanced, ROK forces were often forced to retreat or reposition without the ability to mount effective counterattacks. During the night of 25 to 26 June, DPRK forces continued pushing south. KPA units advancing through the Huizhongbu corridor engaged ROK divisions attempting to form defensive lines north of Seoul. Fighting intensified on June 26th, with several ROK positions collapsing under armored pressure. ROK withdrawals became necessary to avoid encirclement. The movement of refugees along major roads also contributed to logistical difficulties, reducing the ability of ROK units to maneuver effectively. On June 26th, the United States requested that the UN Security Council reconvene. The Council adopted Resolution 83, recommending that UN member states provide military assistance to the Republic of Korea to repel the attack. This resolution laid the foundation for the creation of a unified military command led by the United States. On the battlefield, the situation for the ROK deteriorated further. KPA forces succeeded in breaching defensive lines north of Seoul. By June 27th, DPRK armored units had reached the outskirts of the city. The ROK government ordered the evacuation of key personnel, and United Nations staff began relocating. ROK units attempted to defend positions north and east of the city, but faced overwhelming pressure from coordinated DPRK attacks. The Han River became the next critical defensive line. ROK forces withdrew across the river and destroyed key bridges in an attempt to slow DPRK advances. However, the speed of the DPRK attack made it difficult to conduct an organized withdrawal. Some ROK units were unable to cross before the demolition, leading to the loss of personnel and equipment north of the river. The fall of Seoul occurred on June 28, 1950, 3 days after the initiation of the offensive. ROK forces retreated southward to reorganize defensive positions. The collapse of Seoul marked a decisive moment early in the conflict and demonstrated the extent of the DPRK's initial advantage. The combination of surprise, mechanized superiority, and concentrated offensive planning enabled the DPRK to secure rapid gains. The loss of Seoul generated renewed urgency for an international response. United States President Harry S. Truman authorized additional measures to support the ROK, and on June 30, 1950, he approved the deployment of United States ground forces. This decision marked a significant escalation in American involvement and laid the foundation for the creation of the United Nations Command, which would coordinate multinational forces throughout the war. The first United States ground unit deployed to Korea was Task Force Smith, which began arriving in early July. As of the end of June 1950, DPRK forces held control of Seoul and continued advancing southward, while international response mechanisms were still mobilizing. The opening days of the Korean War produced rapid and decisive changes in the strategic balance across the peninsula. Following the DPRK's coordinated offensive on June 25, 1950, the Korean People's Army, KPA, continued to advance at a pace that exceeded initial expectations within the Republic of Korea, ROK, and the United States. The collapse of defensive positions north of Seoul, combined with the ROK Army's lack of armored capability and limited heavy support, created conditions under which the capital became increasingly vulnerable. The events of 25 to 28 June 1950 shaped the early phase of the war and produced an international response that would significantly alter the conflict's trajectory. After breaching ROK defensive lines along the Wijongbu corridor on June 26, KPA armored and infantry units advanced rapidly towards Seoul. The ROK Army had attempted to organize a defense north of the capital, but the combination of concentrated KPA armor, effective artillery support, and the ROK's lack of anti-tank weaponry rendered these efforts increasingly difficult. Units that had been deployed along extended sectors of the 38th parallel were forced into hurried withdrawals, often under pressure from multiple directions. Communications disrupted by earlier artillery bombardment limited the ability of the ROK headquarters to coordinate movements or establish coherent defensive lines. Throughout 26 to 27 June, ROK units attempted to consolidate positions along the approaches to Seoul. Efforts focused on delaying actions at key road junctions, particularly around Wijongbu and the terrain north of the capital. However, KPA infantry divisions, supported by armored brigades, maintained offensive momentum. Soviet-style operational planning emphasized rapid exploitation of breakthroughs, and DPRK commanders sought to outflank ROK positions rather than engage in prolonged frontal combat. This approach strained ROK defensive capacities and accelerated the pace of the northward collapse. Inside Seoul, the ROK government assessed the deteriorating situation. On June 27th, the ROK cabinet and United States advisors discussed withdrawal and evacuation procedures. Civilian movement increased significantly as residents attempted to leave areas near anticipated combat zones. Traffic on major roads impeded ROK military movements, complicating withdrawal operations. The United States Embassy coordinated with American civilians and UN staff to relocate personnel southward in anticipation of the city's fall. The Han River represented a natural defensive barrier that could potentially slow KPA advances. Recognizing this, ROK forces withdrew across the river and prepared to destroy bridges to delay the DPRK approach. The most significant of these was the main Hangang Bridge, a critical route connecting northern and southern Seoul. Early on the morning of June 28th, ROK engineers detonated the bridge to prevent KPA armored units from crossing. However, the demolition occurred while civilians and some ROK units were still attempting to retreat, resulting in the loss of personnel and equipment. The destruction of the bridge temporarily slowed the DPRK advance, but also complicated ROK movements within southern Seoul. By mid-morning on June 28th, DPRK units entered the northern districts of Seoul. ROK forces, lacking sufficient defensive depth and facing continued pressure from mechanized forces, withdrew from the capital to establish new defensive lines further south. The fall of Seoul occurred just 3 days after the start of the DPRK offensive. DPRK forces secured key government buildings, transportation centers, and communication nodes within the city. The loss of the capital held strategic and symbolic significance, demonstrating the rapid shift in control on the peninsula and underscoring the imbalance between DPRK armored capabilities and ROK defensive capacity. While the military situation deteriorated for the ROK, international diplomatic efforts accelerated. The United Nations Security Council convened on June 25th and adopted Resolution 82, which condemned the DPRK attack and demanded withdrawal to the 38th parallel. As DPRK forces continued advancing, the Security Council met again on June 27th, adopting Resolution 83, which recommended that UN member states provide military assistance to repel the attack and restore peace and security. The absence of the Soviet Union, then boycotting the Council due to disputes over the representation of China, allowed these resolutions to pass. These resolutions created the legal basis for international military involvement under a UN mandate. On June 29th, United States President Harry S. Truman authorized additional air and naval action to support the ROK. The United States Air Force began attacking DPRK targets, including advancing armored columns and logistical nodes. United States naval forces established a more comprehensive presence around the peninsula, providing reconnaissance, bombardment, and logistical support. These initial actions represented an escalation of United States involvement beyond advisory assistance, but did not yet include ground forces. The decision to commit United States ground troops occurred on June 30th, 1950, after Truman consulted with senior military and civilian officials. The rapid fall of Seoul and the collapse of ROK defensive positions underscored the urgency of the situation. The United States determined that without immediate reinforcement, DPRK forces could potentially overrun the entire peninsula. Truman authorized the deployment of United States ground combat units, marking a significant shift in United States policy from limited support to direct military engagement. The first United States ground unit selected for deployment was Task Force Smith, drawn from the 24th Infantry Division stationed in Japan. While Task Force Smith would not arrive on the front until early July, its mobilization symbolized the beginning of a multinational response. The United States also began organizing the United Nations Command, UNC, a unified multinational force structure authorized by Security Council Resolution 84 on July 7, 1950. As the United States and UN responses intensified, ROK forces sought to form new defensive positions south of Seoul. Units withdrew towards Suwon, Chosin, and the approaches to Daejeon. These movements aimed to consolidate the fragmented ROK lines and establish positions where combined ROK United States forces could eventually counter the DPRK advance. The retreat from Seoul, however, involved significant logistical difficulties. The loss of equipment, the destruction of the Hangang Bridge, and the disruption caused by refugee movement all limited the ability of ROK units to reform quickly. DPRK forces continued advancing beyond Seoul. By the end of June, KPA spearheads had crossed the Han River via pontoons and other improvised crossings. KPA engineering units moved rapidly to restore mobility, enabling armored and motorized units to continue their advance southward. DPRK commanders sought to maintain the offensive tempo to prevent ROK forces from establishing stable defensive lines and to capitalize on the initial strategic surprise. The fall of Seoul had implications that extended beyond military operations. Politically, it underscored the urgency of the conflict and solidified international support for intervention. The symbolic impact of losing the capital in such a short time highlighted the disparity between DPRK military strength and the ROK's defenses. Diplomatic communications between Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul intensified, focusing on stabilizing the situation and preventing a rapid DPRK conquest of the entire peninsula. Within the United Nations, the rapid deterioration of conditions reinforced the necessity of a coordinated response. Member states began planning contributions to the emerging UN command. Naval and air forces from several countries, including Australia and the United Kingdom, are prepared to support operations off the Korean peninsula. Although ground contingents would arrive later, the decisions made in late June and early July were shaped directly by the DPRK's rapid advance and the fall of Seoul. The events of 25 to 28 June 1950 demonstrated the consequences of the intelligence failures, structural imbalances, and political conditions. The DPRK offensive achieved rapid success due to mechanized superiority, concentrated planning, and the element of surprise. The ROK Army, lacking tanks, heavy artillery, and air support, was unable to mount an effective defense. International involvement transformed what had begun as a peninsula-confined conflict into a broader military engagement under UN auspices. Following the fall of Seoul on June 28, 1950, DPRK forces continued advancing southward to achieve complete control of the Korean peninsula before substantial United States and United Nations forces could arrive in the theater. The ROK Army, depleted by continuous withdrawals and lacking armored units, heavy artillery, and adequate logistical support, attempted to establish successive defensive lines while absorbing newly arriving American forces. By late July 1950, the conflict had entered a critical phase. The combined ROK United States position contracted steadily under pressure until it formed a reduced defensive arc around the southeastern corner of the peninsula, known as the Pusan Perimeter. The battles fought there between August and September 1950 represented the turning point of the war's opening phase. After the fall of Seoul, ROK forces retreated south towards Suwon, Chosin, and Daejeon. United States ground forces began entering combat in early July, starting with Task Force Smith, a battalion-sized element deployed from Japan. Task Force Smith engaged DPRK forces near Chosin on July 5, 1950, marking the first United States ground engagement of the war. The unit, equipped with limited anti-tank capability and modest artillery support, was unable to stop advancing KPA armored columns and was forced to withdraw. This encounter demonstrated the scale of the challenge the United States faced. Its forward deployed units in Japan, shaped by post-war reductions, lacked the firepower and mobility required to counter Soviet-equipped DPRK formations. As additional United States units from the 24th Infantry Division arrived, they attempted to delay the DPRK advance along key roadways and river lines. The engagement at Taejun in mid-July proved significant. There, elements of the 24th Division conducted a fighting withdrawal under increasing KPA pressure. By July 20th, DPRK units captured Taejun, and the division commander, Major General William F. Dean, was separated from his unit during the retreat and later captured. The loss of Taejun further compressed the United States and ROK defensive positions. By late July, the defense of Korea increasingly centered on establishing a stable perimeter in the southeast. The terrain in this region offered several defensive advantages, a combination of mountain ridges, river lines, and limited avenues of approach that could be fortified more effectively than earlier positions. The port of Pusan, now Busan, provided a critical logistical link through which reinforcements, equipment, ammunition, and supplies from Japan and the United States could arrive in large quantities. Recognizing the importance of maintaining a defensible position, General Douglas MacArthur, commander of United Nations forces, and Lieutenant General Walton H. Walker, commanding the 8th United States Army, developed plans to consolidate forces into a defined perimeter stretching from the Sea of Japan, East Sea, to the Korea Strait. By early August 1950, this defensive line extended approximately 140 to 150 miles, forming an arc around Pusan. Although its shape shifted slightly throughout the campaign, the perimeter generally connected key positions at Pohang in the east, Wagwon in the center, and Masan in the southwest. Defending the Pusan perimeter required integrating multiple forces under intense operational pressure. By mid-August, combined ROK, United States strength within the perimeter included several ROK divisions, the United States 24th Infantry Division, the 1st Cavalry Division, and the 25th Infantry Division. Additional units continued to arrive, including artillery, armor, engineer units, and logistical support. United States Marine Corps elements and British naval forces contributed air and maritime support. Although early arrivals lacked some equipment, the continuous reinforcement stream from Japan strengthened the perimeter each week. The KPA sought to break the perimeter by launching coordinated attacks along multiple axes. DPRK operational planning aimed to exploit limited defensive depth and force the United Nations Command, UNC, into further retreat, ideally capturing Pusan before additional reinforcements could arrive. DPRK forces had advanced rapidly through July, but their supply lines extended significantly, and attrition began to reduce their initial advantage. The eastern sector is centered around Pohang and the Yongdyak corridor. DPRK forces attempted to seize Pohang to cut off UNC supply routes and gain access to Taegu, a major logistical and administrative center. ROK forces, supported by United States air power, defended high ground and river lines. In several engagements, including the fighting near Pohang from 10 to 20 August, the ROK Army held key positions despite sustained pressure. United States airstrikes disrupted KPA supply lines and concentrated troop movements, slowing DPRK advances. In the central sector near Weiguan, the Naktong River became the focal point of major engagements. The river formed one of the most important natural defensive boundaries within the perimeter. Several crossings along the Naktong became sites of intense combat. The First Battle of the Naktong Bulge, occurring between 5 to 19 August 1950, demonstrated the increasing capability of United States units to resist KPA assaults. DPRK units attempted to cross the river using both fording methods and night infiltration tactics. United States artillery and air power, combined with counterattacks by infantry and armor, gradually pushed KPA elements back across the river. The southwestern sector near Masan presented another critical area. DPRK forces attempted to outflank UNC positions by pushing toward the port through the Nam River Valley and the Qingdong-Anai corridor. Elements of the United States 25th Infantry Division engaged in sustained defensive actions throughout August. Terrain features such as ridgelines, saddles, and narrow passes made the fighting in this area particularly intense. Battles near Battle Mountain and Sobek San involved continuous engagements where control shifted repeatedly. Despite initial setbacks, United States forces prevented DPRK units from achieving breakthroughs toward Pusan. Across the entire perimeter, United States and ROK forces began to benefit from improved logistics, increasing troop strength, and air superiority. The port of Pusan operated at maximum capacity, with ships arriving daily to deliver tanks, artillery, ammunition, aircraft parts, medical supplies, and thousands of personnel. This logistical flow provided a significant strategic advantage. While DPRK units relied on extended supply lines vulnerable to air attack, UNC forces received consistent resupply and reinforcement. Air power played a central role in stabilizing the perimeter. United States Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps aircraft conducted close air support, interdiction, and reconnaissance missions. They targeted DPRK troop concentrations, bridges, supply depots, and transport routes. The disruption of KPA logistics reduced the ability of DPRK units to mass for sustained assaults. Air superiority also provided vital support to ground units defending key positions. By early September, UNC forces faced another major series of assaults as the KPA attempted to deliver decisive blows before their own logistical conditions deteriorated further. The Second Battle of the Naktong Bulge, occurring between 1 to 15 September 1950, involved some of the most intense fighting of the Perimeter Campaign. DPRK units once again crossed the Naktong River at multiple points, creating several salients. United States units, including elements of the 1st Cavalry Division, 2nd Infantry Division, and 24th Infantry Division, conducted coordinated counterattacks with armored support. Sustained air and artillery strikes weakened DPRK positions, enabling UNC forces to restore the river line. By mid-September 1950, it became clear that the KPA had exhausted much of its offensive capability. DPRK units suffered from shortages of ammunition, fuel, replacement personnel, and functioning vehicles. The rapid advance from June to July had stretched supply chains beyond sustainable limits. Attrition in earlier battles reduced unit effectiveness. Air interdiction further degraded logistics. As ROK and United States forces strengthened the perimeter, the balance of advantage began shifting. The successful defense of the Pusan Perimeter represented the first major strategic halt of the DPRK offensive. It prevented the immediate collapse of the ROK government and preserved a foothold on the peninsula from which UNC forces could conduct future operations. This defensive success also enabled General MacArthur to proceed with plans for an amphibious landing at Inchon, scheduled for September 15, 1950, which would open a new front and initiate a major counteroffensive. By the end of the perimeter battles, UNC forces had stabilized their positions across the arc surrounding Pusan. The perimeter held, setting the stage for a dramatic shift in the strategic situation. The containment of the DPRK advance during August and early September constituted the decisive defensive phase of the Korean War's opening campaign. With the perimeter secure and reinforcements arriving in increasing numbers, UNC forces prepared to transition from defense to counteroffensive operations. By early September 1950, United Nations Command, UNC, forces had stabilized the Pusan perimeter after weeks of sustained defensive battles. The Korean People's Army, KPA, having advanced rapidly during June and July, now faced extended supply lines, significant attrition, and the effects of continuous UNC air interdiction. Although DPRK units continued launching attacks along the perimeter, their offensive capacity had diminished. This defensive success created the conditions for a major operational shift that would redefine the course of the war. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of UNC forces, had begun considering an amphibious operation as early as July 1950. His objective was to break the stalemate developing at the Pusan perimeter by opening a second front deep in DPRK-controlled territory. The proposed landing site was Inchon, a port city located on the west coast near Seoul. Inchon's location offered significant strategic advantages. Seizure of the port would cut DPRK supply lines, isolate forward KPA units operating near the perimeter, and facilitate the recapture of Seoul. However, the site also presented operational challenges due to tidal extremes, narrow approaches, and restricted maneuver space. The tides at Inchon were among the highest in the world, ranging up to 30 feet. Navigable channels narrowed during low tide, leaving extensive mudflats that prevented landing craft from approaching the shoreline. The harbor required precise timing to allow vessels to enter and exit. Additionally, seawalls surrounding much of Inchon's waterfront limited landing points. These conditions made Inchon a difficult and potentially risky location for an amphibious assault. Many senior United States military leaders expressed reservations, suggesting alternative landing sites such as Kunsan. MacArthur insisted that only Inchon's position relative to Seoul offered the strategic effect necessary to achieve decisive results. Planning accelerated during August 1950. The operation, designated Operation Chromite, involved a complex, multi-phased amphibious landing requiring coordination among naval, air, and ground forces. The United States Navy's 7th Fleet, supported by British and other UN naval units, prepared to provide fire support, mine clearance, and transport for assault troops. The landing force would center on the United States X-Corps, commanded by Major General Edward Almond, composed primarily of the United States 1st Marine Division and the United States Army 7th Infantry Division. To ensure the operation's success, large quantities of supplies, landing craft, and equipment were transferred from Japan. Although the diversion of material to X-Corps imposed constraints on 8th Army forces defending the Pusan Perimeter, MacArthur judged the amphibious landing essential for strategic victory. Intelligence estimates indicated modest DPRK defensive strength around Inchon, as the KPA had concentrated most combat power in the southeast. However, the DPRK maintained garrisons and artillery positions along the west coast, including fortifications on Wolmi-do Island guarding the approach to Inchon Harbor. By early September, preparations neared completion. MacArthur briefed senior officers on the necessity of speed and coordination. He emphasized the importance of landing sufficiently close to Seoul that UNC forces could rapidly seize key objectives before DPRK reinforcements could reposition. The operation sought not only to break the KPA front at Pusan, but also to dislocate the entire DPRK logistical network. In the days preceding the landing, UNC naval and air operations intensified along the west coast. Carrier-based aircraft conducted reconnaissance, targeted artillery positions, and disrupted communications. Naval gunfire reduced fortifications on Wolmi-do and other coastal defenses. These actions aimed to weaken resistance and prevent DPRK forces from mounting a coordinated defense of the landing area. On September 15, 1950, Operation Chromite commenced. The landing proceeded in phases to account for tidal conditions. At 6:30 hours, elements of the United States 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines assaulted Wolmi-do during a high tide window. Naval gunfire from the United States and British ships provided supporting bombardment. The Marines secured the island within hours, eliminating artillery positions that could threaten follow-on waves. Wolmi-do's capture opened the channel for larger vessels to approach Inchon. Later that morning, the main landing force advanced toward Inchon's northern and southern invasion beaches. The Marines landed at Red Beach, north, and Blue Beach, south. Engineers used ladders and scaling ropes to climb seawalls and secure landing zones. DPRK resistance varied across sectors. Some units fought from fixed positions, while others withdrew to avoid being encircled. Despite the operational challenges posed by tides and fortifications, UNC forces established beachheads with fewer casualties than anticipated. By the end of September 15th, the X-Corps had secured primary objectives around Inchon. DPRK forces in the city either withdrew inland or attempted limited delaying actions. Inchon's port facilities, though damaged, were sufficiently intact to allow follow-on landing operations. Reinforcements and supplies began flowing into the newly secured beachhead. MacArthur's strategic objective extended beyond Inchon itself. With the landing area secured, X-Corps advanced east towards Seoul, approximately 25 miles away. The rapid movement toward the capital aimed to sever DPRK supply lines and relieve pressure on 8th Army forces still engaged at the Pusan Perimeter. As UNC forces advanced inland, DPRK defensive positions became increasingly fragmented. The KPA had concentrated most of its forces in the southeast and could not quickly redeploy units to oppose X-Corps. Beginning on September 16th, the day after the Inchon landing, the UNC assault at the Pusan Perimeter entered a new phase. The 8th Army initiated a coordinated breakout operation, pushing against weakened DPRK positions along multiple sectors of the perimeter. The combination of X-Corps landing and 8th Army S offensive created a two-front situation for the DPRK, forcing the KPA to divide its already strained resources. As X-Corps advanced towards Seoul, resistance increased at key terrain points. DPRK forces attempted to delay UNC progress by defending urban areas, road junctions, and natural obstacles. The final stages of the Seoul campaign involved combat in built-up areas, with Marines and Army units engaging DPRK defenders at close range. Although this phase of the operation was not completed on September 15th, the Inchon Landing formed the decisive operational foundation for the recapture of the capital. The strategic impact of the Inchon Landing was immediate and substantial. 1. Disruption of DPRK logistics. Seizing Inchon cut major supply routes supporting DPRK forces operating near Pusan. The KPA's communications and reinforcement networks became fragmented. 2. Two-front pressure. With UNC forces attacking from both the north, Inchon, Seoul axis, and the southeast, Pusan Perimeter, DPRK units faced unsustainable pressure on extended fronts. 3. Loss of operational initiative. DPRK forces, which had dominated the early phases of the war through rapid mechanized advances, began transitioning into defensive operations. 4. Restoration of UNC mobility. Control of Inchon allowed UNC forces to rapidly move supplies, reinforcements, and heavy equipment inland, enabling larger-scale offensive operations. 5. Political effects. The successful landing strengthened international confidence in the UNC mission and validated the decision to conduct a high-risk amphibious assault. By 17 to 18 September, the success of Operation Chromite was clear. X-Corps expanded control of the Inchon area, secured logistical routes, and continued advancing towards Seoul. The landing represented one of the most decisive amphibious operations of the 20th century in terms of strategic effect. In a single day, UNC forces transformed the war from a defensive struggle into a two-front counteroffensive. As X-Corps pressed inland and 8th Army advanced northward from the Pusan Perimeter, DPRK forces began conducting withdrawals in several sectors. The strategic reversal initiated by the Inchon Landing shifted the momentum of the war, setting the stage for the liberation of Seoul on September 25, 1950. The successful amphibious landing at Inchon on September 15, 1950 created an immediate strategic rupture across the Korean peninsula. The DPRK's offensive momentum, already weakened by supply shortages and the extended battles around the Pusan Perimeter, now faced a two-front situation. The United Nations Command, UNC, held the initiative. The 8th United States Army prepared to transition from defensive operations to a general offensive, while X-Corps advanced inland from Inchon to retake Seoul and sever DPRK lines of communication. Between 16 to 20 September 1950, UNC operations in two widely separated sectors, the Inchon-Seoul corridor and the southeastern perimeter, began to converge into a coordinated maneuver aimed at collapsing the entire DPRK position in South Korea. The strategic consequences of Inchon became clear within days. DPRK forces were unable to rapidly reposition units from the southeast to the west, as their communications and transport networks had already degraded under continuous UNC air attacks. Following weeks of defensive operations, the 8th Army initiated a counteroffensive on September 16, 1950, one day after the Inchon landing. The timing was deliberate. General MacArthur intended that X-Corps' landing would force DPRK units to divide their attention, thereby weakening their ability to resist the 8th Army's breakthrough attempts. Lieutenant General Walton H. Walker directed coordinated assaults along multiple points of the perimeter. The breakout began along the Naktong River, particularly where the DPRK had previously established salients during the Naktong Bulge engagements. United States divisions, including the 1st Cavalry Division, the 2nd Infantry Division, and elements of the 24th Infantry Division, advanced across the river under artillery and air support. The ROK Army attacked along adjacent sectors, exploiting weakened DPRK positions. DPRK units attempted local counteractions, but could not stop the coordinated UNC assault. Attrition from earlier battles had reduced their combat strength. Many KPA battalions were under strength, with shortages of ammunition, food, and functioning vehicles. Air interdiction further degraded supply lines, preventing reinforcement or organized withdrawal. By September 18th, UNC forces had broken through major KPA positions along the southern front. The recapture of key road networks and river crossings allowed faster movement northward. The 8th Army advanced through Jinju, Yongsan, and Annam, pursuing retreating DPRK formations. The objective was not simply to reclaim territory, but to prevent the KPA from establishing new defensive lines before X-Corps reached Seoul. While the 8th Army pushed north from Pusan, X-Corps advanced east from Inchon toward Seoul, a distance of roughly 25 miles. The route to the capital involved urbanized terrain, multiple river obstacles, and established DPRK defensive positions. Wolmi-do and the Inchon docks were secured on September 15th, allowing rapid unloading of equipment and reinforcements. Beginning September 16th, the United States 1st Marine Division moved inland along the main Seoul Highway, encountering initial resistance on the outskirts as DPRK units attempted to establish delaying positions. The Marines captured Kimpo Airfield on September 17th, a key objective that allowed UNC aircraft to operate closer to the front and accelerate logistical support. Kimpo's capture also prevented DPRK use of the airfield for reinforcement or evacuation. DPRK units defending Seoul consisted of mixed formations from frontline divisions and rear area security units. While the KPA maintained a numerical presence in the region, its ability to mount coordinated defense had diminished due to the disruption caused by the Inchon Landing. DPRK commanders attempted to concentrate forces within Seoul's urban terrain, believing street fighting could slow UNC progress. The breakout at the Pusan Perimeter and the advance from Inchon were not independent operations. UNC headquarters coordinated movements to ensure maximum pressure on DPRK forces. As 8th Army units advanced northward, they aimed to reach the Han River and link with X-Corps, cutting off retreat routes for KPA units south of Seoul. By 20–21 September, UNC progress accelerated. DPRK resistance in several sectors eroded under combined infantry, armor, artillery, and air pressure. Retreating KPA units faced the dual threat of being overtaken by 8th Army forces from the southeast and being cut off by X-Corps approaching from the west. X-Corps reached the outskirts of Seoul by September 22nd. The final approach required crossing the Han River and engaging established DPRK defensive positions. The river crossings involved engineering operations under fire, as DPRK artillery and infantry attempted to disrupt UNC movement. However, UNC air superiority suppressed many defensive sites, enabling bridging units to operate. The battle for Seoul unfolded in distinct phases, securing the western and southwestern districts, crossing the Han River and entering central Seoul, clearing government areas, road junctions, and industrial zones, neutralizing remaining pockets of resistance in northern districts. Urban combat required house-to-house clearing, the capture of fortified buildings, and coordinated movement through narrow streets. The DPRK defended from prepared positions, but lacked the heavy weapons necessary to halt mechanized UNC units for extended periods. As X-Corps pushed into Seoul, DPRK units south of the capital faced increasing danger of encirclement. 8th Army forces advancing northward threatened to cut DPRK escape routes east of the city. The KPA command attempted partial withdrawals, but logistical collapse and disrupted communication prevented orderly movement. Between 22 to 24 September, UNC ground forces continued to compress DPRK defenses. ROK units, now reinforced and better supplied, recaptured several towns around the capital and engaged retreating DPRK elements attempting to regroup northward. By September 25, 1950, UNC forces secured central Seoul. Major government facilities, communication centers, and key intersections came under UNC control. Remaining DPRK resistance in the northern districts was subdued over the next 2 days, but the city was effectively under UNC administration by the evening of September 25th. The recapture of Seoul held military and political significance. Operational impact. DPRK supply routes were severed. KPA units south of the city lost their principal logistical hub. Strategic impact. The UNC now controlled a major transportation network, enabling rapid redeployment. Political impact. Re-establishing the ROK government in its capital reinforced international legitimacy and restored a symbolic center of authority. The liberation of Seoul also marked the culmination of the Inchon operation. Within 10 days, X-Corps had secured a major port, recaptured the ROK capital, and disrupted the DPRK's operational coherence. As the battles around Seoul concluded, the 8th Army continued to advance northward. Major cities such as Taijeon, Taegu, and Pohang were securely in UNC hands. KPA formations, which had begun the war with strong mechanized capabilities, now suffered from shortages of tanks, vehicles, ammunition, and fuel. Many units withdrew toward the 38th parallel. UNC forces captured large quantities of abandoned equipment, including damaged tanks, artillery pieces, supply trucks, and small arms. Numerous DPRK soldiers were captured during the retreat, while others attempted to move into mountainous terrain to evade capture. The rapid shift from near collapse at the Pusan Perimeter in August to the liberation of Seoul in September resulted from several interconnected factors: UNC air and naval superiority. Continuous interdiction restricted DPRK mobility and weakened frontline operations. Operational shock from Inchon. The landing created a second front, rupturing DPRK planning. Coordinated two-front assault. X-Corps and 8th Army movements compressed DPRK units between converging pressures. Logistical overextension of the KPA. DPRK supply lines, stretched across the length of the peninsula, could not support sustained resistance. Improved UNC strength and reinforcements. By mid-September, UNC forces had grown substantially in manpower and equipment. With Seoul retaken and DPRK forces retreating northward, UNC leaders considered next steps. The immediate phase of the war, the DPRK invasion, the ROK, United States defensive struggle, the Inchon Landing, and the subsequent counteroffensive, had concluded with a decisive UNC victory. As of late September 1950, the front line approached the 38th parallel. Military planners evaluated options for pursuing the KPA across the border. By the end of September 1950, United Nations Command, UNC, forces had reversed the strategic situation across the Korean peninsula. The breakout from the Pusan Perimeter, combined with the Inchon Landing and the liberation of Seoul on September 25, 1950, left the Korean People's Army, KPA, in retreat. UNC forces recaptured major cities, reclaimed transportation routes, and regained operational momentum. As DPRK units withdrew northward, often in fragmented formations, the conflict transitioned from the defensive and counteroffensive phases, the advance toward the 38th parallel and beyond. Following the liberation of Seoul, a policy debate emerged among UNC member states and within the United States government regarding whether military operations should continue beyond the 38th parallel. The initial UN mandate, outlined in Resolutions 82, 83, and later 84, authorized repelling the DPRK attack and restoring international peace and security, but the resolutions did not explicitly define territorial boundaries for military action. By October 1950, two key strategic considerations shaped discussions: eliminating the DPRK's ability to wage further war, preventing future large-scale invasions against the ROK. The Truman administration concluded that restoring the status quo at the 38th parallel would leave the DPRK intact and capable of rebuilding. Intelligence assessments suggested that KPA units were withdrawing in disorder and might collapse entirely. This assessment influenced decision-making in Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul. On October 7, 1950, the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 376-V, authorizing UNC forces to operate north of the 38th parallel to establish a unified, stable Korean government under UN supervision. With this authorization, UNC ground forces prepared to resume their advance. The KPA retreat from September into October resulted in significant losses. Many units operated at reduced strength. Equipment captured by UNC forces indicated severe shortages of ammunition, fuel, and vehicles. Soviet-made T-34-85 tanks, effective early in the war, now appeared in reduced numbers due to destruction, mechanical failure, or abandonment. Air interdiction continued to degrade DPRK mobility. As a result, the KPA attempted to establish defensive lines north of the 38th parallel, but lacked sufficient personnel and equipment for sustained resistance. Retreating units moved toward Pyongyang and the northern provinces, attempting to reorganize. With authorization to proceed north, UNC forces crossed the 38th parallel in early October. The ROKI Corps, operating on the east coast, crossed near Goseong on October 1, 1950, becoming the first major formation to re-enter Northern Territory. The United States 8th Army, advancing along central and western axes, crossed shortly afterward. The advance proceeded along multiple routes. 8th Army, west/central, moving toward Pyongyang. X-Corps, East Coast, landed at Wonsan and advanced inland, and ROK forces, northeast, pushing toward Hamhung and the mountainous interior. In the west, United States units encountered sporadic resistance as they advanced through Kaesong, Kumchin, and Sariwon. ROK units often advanced faster than American formations, as KPA forces in several areas had already withdrawn. Pyongyang, the DPRK capital, became the primary objective of 8th Army operations in October. Intelligence reports indicated that remaining KPA units were attempting to organize defensive positions north and west of the city. However, UNC coordination, combined with continuous air attacks, limited the DPRK's ability to form cohesive lines. ROK forces from the I Corps reached the outskirts of Pyongyang on October 19, 1950. Elements of the United States 1st Cavalry Division entered the city on the same day. Organized DPRK resistance collapsed rapidly. Pyongyang fell to UNC forces within hours, marking the second capital to change hands during the conflict. The capture of Pyongyang had operational significance. It eliminated the DPRK's principal command and administrative center. It disrupted the remaining KPA logistical network. It allowed UNC units to pursue retreating forces toward the northern provinces. While the 8th Army advanced through the western corridor, the X-Corps conducted amphibious landings along the east coast as part of the broader northward movement. Originally planned for Wonsan, the landing, scheduled for early October, was delayed because ROK forces, advancing overland, reached the city before the amphibious task force could land. Mines slowed naval clearance operations, but X-Corps ultimately landed at Wonsan between 26 to 28 October 1950. From there, the United States 1st Marine Division and the 7th Infantry Division advanced inland toward Hamhung and the Chosin Reservoir region. The terrain in the east was mountainous, with limited road infrastructure, complicating movement and logistical support. However, resistance remained light as DPRK units continued withdrawing northward. By late October, UNC plans increasingly focused on closing the conflict by reaching the Yalu River, the border between Korea and the People's Republic of China. Intelligence assessments varied widely regarding potential Chinese intervention. While some analysts reported increased Chinese military activity along the Yalu, others judged that China would avoid direct involvement unless foreign forces crossed into Manchuria. MacArthur's headquarters concluded that the DPRK's collapse left limited opportunity for coordinated Chinese intervention. By this time, however, Chinese forces had already crossed into northern Korea. Between 14 to 20 October 1950, elements of the Chinese People's Volunteers, CPV, began crossing the Yalu River into northern Korea. The PRC leadership, concerned about the proximity of UNC forces to its border, initiated this movement before public announcements were made. Crossing points included Sinuiju, Monpa, and Hysan. Intelligence reports from UNC units noted unusual movements, but lacked clarity regarding size and intent. Estimates of initial Chinese deployments varied, but the first phase involved approximately 180,000 troops from multiple armies. These units moved through rugged terrain, often at night, to avoid detection. Chinese forces utilized limited road networks and relied heavily on foot movement, reducing vulnerability to air attacks. Despite these movements, UNC leadership considered large-scale Chinese intervention unlikely. Air reconnaissance struggled to detect troop concentrations due to terrain and concealment tactics. Some intelligence analysts warned of increased risks, but these assessments did not produce immediate changes in operational planning. Through late October, UNC forces continued northward. In the west, the 8th Army advanced toward Changju, Unsan, and the approaches to the Yalu. In the east, X-Corps units pushed through Hamhung and toward the Chosin Reservoir. ROK divisions advanced along both coastal and inland routes, aiming to reach the northernmost towns before winter conditions restricted movement. During this period, Chinese units conducted limited engagements to test UNC responses. On October 25, 1950, CPV forces ambushed elements of the ROK-2 Corps near Anjiang and engaged United States units near Unsan. These battles marked the beginning of the first phase campaign. UNC commanders interpreted these engagements as isolated incidents rather than indicators of a major intervention. This interpretation aligned with earlier intelligence assessments that downplayed the possibility of full-scale Chinese involvement. Multiple factors shaped the concluding stage of the northward advance. Terrain. Northern Korea's mountainous roads slowed movement and stretched supply lines. Weather. Temperatures dropped rapidly, foreshadowing severe winter conditions. Logistics. UNC supply lines extended hundreds of miles from southern ports. Air supplies supplemented ground transport, but could not fully mitigate delays. Force dispersion. UNC divisions advanced along widely separated axes without continuous frontline cohesion. Unknown enemy presence. Chinese units were now inside Korea in significant numbers, though their full strength remained undetected. By October 31, 1950, UNC forces controlled most of North Korea. UNC operational maps showed advancing units within 50 to 70 miles of the Yalu at several points. ROK forces reached Hyesanjin and other northern positions. The strategic assumption remained that victory was near if the remaining DPRK resistance could be overcome. However, the presence of Chinese forces in Korea introduced a new strategic variable. Although their role was not fully understood, their initial attacks signaled the beginning of a phase fundamentally different from the earlier stages of the conflict. By late October 1950, United Nations Command, UNC, forces controlled most of North Korea. The 8th Army advanced through the western and central corridors toward the Yalu River, while X-Corps moved inland from the east coast toward the Chosin Reservoir and the northern mountain ranges. The Korean People's Army, KPA, significantly weakened after months of combat, retreated north in fragmented formations. The conflict appeared on the verge of conclusion. However, a new factor, Chinese military intervention, began to shape events. The People's Republic of China, PRC, had determined by early October that UNC forces approaching the Yalu River posed a direct threat to Chinese national security. Although diplomatic channels conveyed warnings, Chinese intentions remained uncertain to foreign observers. Beginning 14 to 20 October 1950, elements of the Chinese People's Volunteers, CPV, crossed the Yalu River into North Korea using multiple routes, including Jian, Monpa, and Sinaju. Chinese forces moved primarily at night, dispersed along mountain trails to avoid detection. As a result, early UNC intelligence assessments underestimated both the scale and significance of these movements. The initial Chinese deployment involved an estimated 180,000 troops, with additional units staged in Manchuria. These included multiple Army corps drawn from the 4th Field Army, commanded by General Peng Dehuai, who had been appointed commander of the CPV. Chinese forces utilized light infantry doctrine emphasizing mobility, night operations, and decentralized maneuver methods well suited to the mountainous terrain of northern Korea. The first significant engagement between Chinese and UNC forces occurred on October 25, 1950, when Chinese units struck elements of the ROK-2 Corps near the town of Anjong, west of the Chosin Reservoir region. ROK units advancing north encountered unexpectedly strong resistance and suffered significant losses. Chinese tactics emphasized surprise, encirclement, and infiltration. Units often attacked at night, targeting communication lines and command posts. These methods disrupted ROK formations and produced uncertainty regarding the identity of the opposing force. On the same day, additional Chinese units engaged United States forces near Unsan, northeast of Pyongyang. The 8th Cavalry Regiment of the United States 1st Cavalry Division encountered Chinese forces employing coordinated assaults supported by bugle calls, whistles, and flares to signal movement. Intense fighting occurred from 1 to 4 November, resulting in heavy United States casualties and the encirclement of several companies. Withdrawal under fire allowed surviving units to consolidate south of the engagement zone. Despite these battles, the Chinese first phase offensive did not aim to destroy UNC forces outright. Instead, it sought to accomplish 3 objectives: test UNC strength and operational patterns, protect key approaches to the Yalu River, conceal China's full military commitment until larger forces were in place. Chinese commanders withdrew after initial engagements, confusing UNC intelligence analysts, who interpreted the withdrawals as signs of limited or localized involvement. This misinterpretation delayed the development of accurate assessments. Throughout late October and early November, UNC intelligence reports varied in quality. Aerial reconnaissance struggled to detect Chinese movements due to terrain and nighttime displacement. Chinese forces minimized vehicle use to avoid detection, relying instead on foot columns and pack transport. Weather conditions further limited visibility. Reports from ground units noted unusual tactics and greater than expected enemy strength, but these observations did not immediately alter broader strategic assumptions. Some analysts assessed that Chinese forces were operating in small numbers to assist remaining KPA units. Others believed the engagements represented isolated actions rather than sustained intervention. General Douglas MacArthur and Far East Command staff concluded in late October that while some Chinese units may have entered Korea, the PRC was unlikely to initiate a full-scale campaign. This assessment influenced operational decisions, including continued plans for rapid advance toward the Yalu River. Chinese operations from October 25 to early November 1950 involved multiple engagements across the central and northeastern sectors. Anjong, destruction of elements of ROK-2 Corps. Unsan, engagement with the United States 1st Cavalry Division units. Cheongju and Kajangdong regions, probes and ambushes against advancing UNC forces and Taekon and Takshan areas. Night infiltration attacks disrupting ROK advances. Chinese units sought to degrade UNC momentum, gather intelligence on unit composition, and delay the approach toward the Yalu. Their operations were designed to appear limited to avoid escalation before full Chinese forces were in position. Following the engagements at Anjong and Unsan, Chinese forces withdrew northward into the mountains. This withdrawal reinforced UNC's beliefs that the enemy forces were small, and lacked the capability for sustained operations. As a result, UNC units resumed their advance northward in early November. In the west, 8th Army forces pushed toward the Changchun River, intending to resume the general offensive toward the Yalu by mid-November. In the east, X Corps advanced toward the Chosin Reservoir and Udamanai. ROK units moved north in both coastal and central mountain corridors. During this period, UNC units reported encountering deserted DPRK positions, abandoned equipment, and minimal resistance. These observations contributed to the prevailing perception that the DPRK had collapsed and that Chinese forces were not yet positioned for major operations. While UNC forces advanced, Chinese leadership prepared for a larger campaign. The initial movement of approximately 180,000 troops into Korea during October was followed by additional deployments in early November. Supply routes crossing the Yalu were maintained at night to avoid air attacks. Chinese logistics relied heavily on porters and decentralized stockpiles, reducing vulnerability to bombing. Chinese operational planning for the coming phase emphasized surprise, concentration of force at selected points, and coordinated assaults along multiple axes. Their goal was to launch a major offensive once UNC units had extended their lines and dispersed across the mountainous terrain of northern Korea. The first phase offensive demonstrated several core Chinese methods. Night operations. Most attacks occurred after dark to negate UNC air superiority. Infiltration. Chinese forces bypassed strong points, targeting command posts, artillery positions, and supply lines. Encirclement. Engagements at Unsan and Anjiang involved surrounding targeted units to create disorganization. Concealment and withdrawal. After initial engagements, Chinese units pulled back to higher ground, reducing the appearance of a large-scale presence. Terrain exploitation. Mountain paths allowed Chinese forces to position themselves above advancing UNC units. These methods differed significantly from earlier KPA tactics and provided clues regarding the identity of the new opponent. However, the withdrawal patterns misled UNC analysts. By early November 1950, UNC forces continued their northward advance, unaware of the scale of Chinese deployments. The 8th Army prepared for a general offensive scheduled to begin in late November, aiming to reach the Yalu River and end organized resistance. X-Corps units approached the Chosin Reservoir, establishing forward positions in anticipation of continued operations. Although intelligence reports noted possible concentrations of enemy troops in the mountains, the prevailing interpretation within Far East Command remained that Chinese involvement was limited. As a consequence, UNC operational planning did not shift from the assumption that victory was near. The Chinese first phase offensive succeeded in achieving its primary objectives. UNC forces were tested and probed, not decisively attacked. Chinese presence remained partially concealed. UNC commanders continued advancing into positions that would later prove vulnerable. Strategic surprise was preserved for the forthcoming major offensive. By early November 1950, United Nations Command, UNC, forces had advanced deep into North Korea, operating under the assumption that organized resistance was nearing collapse. The 8th Army moved northwest toward the Yalu River through the Changchun River Valley, while X-Corps advanced north from Wonsan toward the Chosin Reservoir and the northeastern mountains. Although Chinese forces had conducted limited engagements during the first phase offensive in late October, their withdrawals led UNC commanders to conclude that the Chinese presence was minor. This assessment proved incorrect. China had positioned large formations throughout northern Korea, preparing for coordinated operations. Chinese People's Volunteers (CPV) forces in Korea by mid-November included approximately 300,000 to 320,000 troops, supported by an additional large reserve force in Manchuria. Organized into multiple army corps, these units occupied positions along mountain ridges, valleys, and key passes. Their operational plan aimed to exploit the dispersion of UNC forces, which advanced along separate axes separated by significant distances. The 8th Army operated on the Western and Central fronts. X-Corps operated independently on the Eastern Front. ROK units advanced along parallel but isolated routes. These separations reduced UNC's ability to reinforce rapidly across sectors, creating conditions favorable to Chinese encirclement operations. Chinese objectives for the second phase offensive included delivering a large-scale surprise assault, severing UNC formations before they reached the Yalu River, forcing a major withdrawal that would alter the balance of the war. The offensive began on November 25, 1950. The main Chinese assault struck the 8th Army along the Chosin River. Units from the Chinese 13th Army Group targeted United States and ROK formations, including the United States 2nd Infantry Division, the 24th Infantry Division, and the ROK 2 Corps. Beginning on the night of November 25th, Chinese infantry launched coordinated attacks along a broad front. Using night operations to negate UNC air power, Chinese units moved through mountain passes and against exposed flanks. Bugle calls, whistles, and coordinated signals guided infantry through the darkness, enabling large formations to maneuver rapidly. Several key sectors collapsed quickly. ROK 2 Corps suffered severe losses and began withdrawing under pressure. The United States 2nd Infantry Division faced attacks on multiple sides. Gaps emerged between UNC units, exposing routes for deeper Chinese penetration. By November 27th, Chinese forces had driven wedges across the front, forcing the 8th Army to withdraw towards Suncheon, Kuri, and Unju. Roads became congested with retreating units and vehicles. Bitter cold and frozen terrain impeded mobility. One of the most significant events in the western sector occurred during the withdrawal from Kuri. As elements of the United States 2nd Infantry Division began retreating south, Chinese forces occupied ridge lines dominating the main road. Attempting to withdraw through the Kuri Pass, the division encountered intense fire from Chinese units positioned on both sides of the route. The narrow valley channelized traffic, causing severe delays. Several battalions suffered substantial casualties while attempting to break through ambush positions. Despite intense pressure, surviving elements of the division reached new defensive lines further south. The withdrawal from Kuri became one of the defining episodes of the second phase offensive, illustrating the degree to which Chinese forces had disrupted 8th Army cohesion. By November 30th, the 8th Army had abandoned its objectives near the Yalu and begun a general retreat toward Pyongyang. Chinese forces pursued, seeking to maintain pressure and prevent the establishment of new defensive positions. Snowfall, freezing temperatures, and logistical strain compounded UNC's difficulties. On December 4, 1950, the 8th Army withdrew from Pyongyang. Chinese advances continued south of the city, targeting routes towards Sariwon and the Inchon River. The speed of the 8th Army's withdrawal marked the most rapid retreat in United States military history up to that time. While the 8th Army fought along the Changchun River, X-Corps faced its own crisis in the Northeast. The United States 1st Marine Division, the United States 7th Infantry Division, and ROK units advanced toward the Chosin Reservoir region, also known as Chongqing. The terrain was mountainous, with temperatures dropping well below freezing in late November. Chinese forces from the 9th Army Group, recently deployed into Korea, occupied positions around the reservoir. Their objective was to encircle and destroy X-Corps units. On November 27, 1950, Chinese forces launched coordinated night assaults across the eastern sector. The Marines at Udaminai, the 7th Infantry Division units at Hagaruri and Katari, and ROK forces further east faced encirclement attempts. Chinese tactics emphasized blocking withdrawal routes, attacking supply lines, occupying high ground, and cutting communication links. Despite heavy pressure, the Marines at Udaminai consolidated their positions and prepared for a fighting withdrawal toward Hagaruri, which held the only airstrip capable of receiving transport aircraft. From 1 to 9 December 1950, X-Corps executed a deliberate withdrawal southward through narrow mountain passes under continuous Chinese pressure. Temperatures reached as low as -30 degrees Celsius, affecting weapons function and causing severe frostbite casualties. Chinese units attempted to block the route at multiple points, including Taktong Pass, Funchalen Pass, and the southern approach toward Hungnam. United States engineering units constructed an emergency bridge segment to cross a destroyed span near Koto-ri, enabling the column to continue its withdrawal. Close air support from Marine and Air Force aircraft provided critical assistance, targeting Chinese concentrations along ridge lines and protecting withdrawal routes. By December 11th, X-Corps completed its retreat to the coastal city of Hungnam, where evacuation operations began. The withdrawal from the Chosin Reservoir, while costly, prevented the destruction of X-Corps and allowed thousands of troops and civilians to evacuate by sea. Between 12 to 24 December 1950, UNC forces conducted the evacuation of Hungnam. Naval vessels transported approximately 105,000 troops, 17,500 vehicles, 350,000 tons of equipment, and tens of thousands of Korean civilians. This operation preserved X-Corps for future combat operations. Once the evacuation was complete, the port facilities were destroyed to prevent Chinese use. The combined effects of Chinese attacks on both fronts forced UNC forces to withdraw across the entire theater. By late December 1950, the 8th Army established new defensive lines south of the 38th parallel. Chinese forces captured Pyongyang, advanced through the Central Corridor, and approached Seoul. By January 4, 1951, Chinese and DPRK forces entered Seoul, marking the second time the capital had changed hands during the war. The second phase offensive inflicted severe operational and psychological impact on UNC leadership, reversal of momentum. UNC forces shifted from advancing toward the Yalu to retreating hundreds of miles. Loss of territory. Nearly all gains made during the October-November advance were reversed. Operational disruption. The dispersion of UNC forces north of the 38th parallel exposed vulnerabilities exploited by Chinese tactics. Cold weather attrition. Thousands of frostbite cases occurred during operations in the Northeast. Requirement for reorganization. Both 8th Army and X-Corps required major restructuring to stabilize the front. Several structural and operational factors shaped the retreat. Underestimation of Chinese intentions. extended supply lines, overconfidence following earlier successes, terrain and weather constraints, and lack of unified command between 8th Army and X-Corps. These conditions enabled Chinese forces to gain operational surprise and deliver concentrated attacks against dispersed UNC formations. By late December 1950, Chinese forces slowed their advance as logistics and overextension began affecting their operations. UNC forces stabilized defensive lines south of Seoul and prepared for subsequent engagements. The second phase offensive marked the climax of Chinese intervention and initiated the intermediate stage of the conflict, during which stabilization and counteroffensive operations would follow. The Chinese second phase offensive forced United Nations Command, UNC, forces into a substantial withdrawal across the Korean Peninsula during November and December 1950. By early January 1951, the 8th Army had retreated south of the 38th parallel, and X-Corps, evacuated from Hungnam, had relocated to the southeastern region of the peninsula. Chinese People's Volunteers, CPV, and remaining Korean People's Army, KPA, forces advanced southward, capturing Seoul on January 4, 1951, marking the second loss of the capital during the war. Despite these setbacks, the UNC maintained cohesive force structures and retained significant advantages in logistics, firepower, and mobility. The period between January and March 1951 marked a transition from large-scale retreat to stabilization and controlled counteroffensive. This stage centered on halting Chinese momentum, reconstituting UNC units, and conducting limited operations to regain key terrain. The most consequential engagement during this period was the Battle of Chipiong-Anai in February 1951, which demonstrated the UNC's capability to resist and defeat large-scale Chinese assaults. Lieutenant General Matthew B. Ridgway assumed command of the 8th Army on December 26, 1950, following the death of General Walton H. Walker in a vehicle accident. Ridgway directed immediate improvements in defensive posture, emphasizing mobility, fire discipline, coordinated artillery use, and rigorous logistical support. UNC forces began consolidating along what became known as the Line D, stretching from the Han River in the west toward Wonju and further east. Defensive positions were established on elevations suitable for observation and artillery coordination. Ridgway emphasized maintaining shorter, more defensible lines, avoiding overextension into mountainous terrain without sufficient support. The ROK Army, significantly affected by prior defeats, initiated reorganization with United States assistance. Reinforcements, equipment, and training programs allowed ROK units to reconstitute their fighting capability throughout January. From December 31, 1950 to mid-January 1951, Chinese and DPRK forces launched another major offensive, known as the Third Phase Offensive. Chinese strategy sought to exploit what they perceived as UNC vulnerability following the retreat from the north. Their objectives included driving UNC forces farther south, capturing key transportation hubs, particularly Wonju and Suwon, maintaining pressure to prevent UNC reorganization. Chinese assaults targeted both 8th Army and newly repositioned X-Corps units. ROK units along the eastern sector faced intense pressure, leading to temporary withdrawals. UNC air and artillery support proved essential in slowing CPV advances. Despite initial gains, Chinese forces encountered logistical constraints similar to those that had limited their earlier momentum. Extended supply lines, severe winter weather, and scarcity of motorized transport hindered sustained operations. As Chinese advances slowed by mid-January, UNC assessments concluded that the enemy lacked the capability for continuous offensive action without pause. Recognizing signs of Chinese overstretch, Ridgway ordered a series of limited counteroffensives aimed at regaining key terrain and disrupting Chinese preparations for further large-scale attacks. The first of these operations, Operation Thunderbolt, commenced on January 25, 1951. It involved coordinated movements by 8th Army formations along the western corridor towards Suwon and the Han River. Operation Thunderbolt proceeded with methodical advances, employing reconnaissance, artillery preparation, and combined infantry armor assaults. UNC aircraft conducted interdiction missions against Chinese supply routes. Progress was steady, and Chinese resistance remained inconsistent. Following Thunderbolt, UNC launched Operation Roundup and Operation Killer in February. These operations aimed to eliminate remaining Chinese and DPRK concentrations between Wanzhou and the Han River. ROK units, now reorganized and reinforced, played central roles in these offensives. Key objectives included clearing Chinese forces from the Wanzhou, Hongsong region, securing routes between the central and eastern sectors, and establishing control of high ground for future operations. By late February, UNC forces regained significant territory south of the Han River and improved overall defensive positioning. The town of Cheopyeong-Anai, located at a key road junction in central Korea, became the focal point of the Chinese effort to halt UNC momentum. The town lay at the intersection of multiple valleys and passes leading toward Wanzhou, Hongsong, and the northeastern mountains. Control of Cheopyeong-Anai allowed movement between sectors. Its loss would have exposed UNC positions to encirclement. The Chinese command recognized the strategic importance of the location. Their plan involved isolating and destroying UNC forces positioned in the town before reinforcements could arrive. UNC leadership understood the risk, but also recognized the opportunity. Holding Cheopyeong-Anai would not only blunt a major Chinese counterattack, but also demonstrate the restored capability of UNC forces to resist large-scale assaults. UNC forces occupying Cheopyeong-Anai consisted primarily of the 23rd Regimental Combat Team, RCT, of the United States 2nd Infantry Division, supported by a French battalion, artillery units, engineers, and logistical elements. Commanded by Colonel Paul L. Freeman, Jr., the 23rd RCT established a perimeter defense around the town, integrating mutually supporting strongpoints and artillery positions. Prepared positions included trenches and foxholes are oriented toward likely avenues of approach. Coordinated artillery batteries capable of firing in all directions. Observation posts along the surrounding ridgelines, and communications links to nearby UNC units positioned to the south and west supply stockpiles were established to ensure the unit could withstand multi-day isolation if necessary. Chinese forces initiated the attack on February 13, 1951 as part of the broader Fourth Phase Offensive. Multiple CPV divisions, including units from the 39th, 40th, and 42nd Armies, surrounded the town. Their objective was to encircle and eliminate the 23rd RCT before UNC reinforcements could reach the area. The assault unfolded in several phases. Initial encirclement. Chinese units closed roads and passes surrounding Cheopyeong-Anai, severing the main routes for reinforcement and withdrawal. Night attacks. Chinese infantry launched repeated nighttime assaults, attempting to penetrate the perimeter using infiltration and massed infantry waves. Pressure on strong points. Focal points included the southeastern and northwestern sectors, where terrain offered opportunities to concentrate attacking forces. The 23rd RCT maintained coordinated defense, employing machine guns, mortars, and artillery. Air support from UNC aircraft targeted Chinese troop concentrations during daylight hours. The perimeter remained intact despite continuous assaults. As Chinese attacks continued through 14 to 15 February, Ridgway ordered relief forces to advance toward Chipiang-Anai. Coordinated movements from the 1st Cavalry Division and the 24th Infantry Division pushed northward through contested terrain. On February 15th, relief columns reached the vicinity of Chipiang-Anai. Combined pressure from the garrison and approaching UNC units forced Chinese forces to withdraw. Chinese casualties were substantial, and their inability to destroy the 23rd RCT marked a significant setback. The defense of Chipiang-Anai held extensive implications for the course of the war, demonstration of UNC resilience. The engagement showed that UNC forces could withstand and repel large-scale Chinese assaults under encirclement conditions. Stabilization of Central Front. Holding Chipiang-Anai secured key roads and prevented further Chinese advances toward Wanzhou. Shift in operational momentum. After Chipiang-Anai, Chinese forces transitioned from offensive operations into defensive withdrawals at several points along the front. Foundation for future counteroffensives. The battle demonstrated that UNC forces were capable of resuming broader offensive campaigns once weather and logistics improved. Following the success at Chipiang-Anai, UNC forces launched Operation Ripper on March 7, 1951, a major offensive aimed at recapturing Seoul and clearing remaining Chinese and DPRK forces from Central Korea. By mid-March, UNC forces recaptured Seoul on March 14, 1951, re-establishing control of the capital for the third time during the war. Between January and March 1951, UNC forces transformed a precarious situation into one of relative stability. Key factors included improved defensive coordination, effective use of artillery and air power, reconstituted ROK forces, recognition of Chinese logistical limits, and successful defensive stands at key locations, including Chipiang-Anai. By March 1951, United Nations Command, UNC, forces had regained Seoul, stabilized front lines, and halted the momentum of Chinese People's Volunteers, CPV, and Korean People's Army, KPA, operations. The winter offensives launched by Chinese forces between December 1950 and January 1951 had exhausted their logistical capacity, and UNC counteroffensives, most notably Operations Killer, Ripper, and Courageous, recaptured key terrain south of the 38th parallel. With the liberation of Seoul on March 14, 1951, the Korean War entered its longest phase, a prolonged stalemate marked by limited offensives, attrition, and protracted armistice negotiations. UNC forces assessed the feasibility of extending operations north of the 38th parallel. The objective was not the total defeat of the CPV or collapse of the DPRK, but rather the establishment of advantageous defensive lines that could support armistice negotiations while maintaining operational security. General Matthew Ridgway, now commander of the 8th Army, and after April 1951, overall commander of UNC forces, focused on methodical, limited advances to secure dominant terrain features. Chinese and DPRK forces, having suffered substantial attrition during the winter and early spring, adopted more defensive postures. Although they retained the ability to launch localized offensives, their logistics, transportation networks, and supply lines remained constrained by air interdiction and the rugged terrain of the Korean peninsula. By mid-1951, the conflict transitioned into a limited war characterized by stabilized front lines with minimal large-scale movement, emphasis on key ridgelines, hills, and fortified positions, continuous small unit engagements, artillery duels and defensive fortification building, air interdiction and strategic bombing campaigns, and political negotiations are operating in parallel with battlefield actions. The front line gradually solidified along a curve roughly corresponding to what is now the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ. UNC launched a series of operations in May and June 1951 to consolidate territory and improve defensive lines before the anticipated summer offensive by Chinese and DPRK forces. Key operations included Operation Dauntless, April 22, 1951, Operation Detonate, May 5, 1951, and Operation Piledriver, June 3, 1951. These operations aimed to capture dominating ground north of Seoul, including the Iron Triangle region bounded by Pyeongtaek, Chorwon, and Kumwa. The area served as a critical transportation and operations hub for CPV and DPRK forces. UNC forces, including the United States I Corps, 9 Corps, and ROK units, advanced systematically, using artillery and air support to overcome well-prepared enemy positions. Terrain such as Hill 355, Hill 979, and multiple ridgelines became key objectives. Chinese forces attempted to regain momentum through a major offensive beginning on April 22, 1951. Known as the Fifth Phase Offensive, Chinese planners intended to deliver multi-army assaults across the Inchon River and East Central sectors. The offensive unfolded in two principal stages. The first stage, 22 to 29 April, targeting Seoul, and the second stage, 16 May 20th May, targeting the central sector around Chuncheon and the Handan River. While CPV forces initially achieved penetrations, UNC firepower, especially artillery employment and the use of prepared defensive lines, halted the offensive. Chinese units suffered heavy casualties and failed to recapture Seoul or disrupt the UNC organization. Attrition significantly weakened CPV capabilities for sustained offensive action. By June 1951, it became clear to both sides that achieving a decisive victory through maneuver was unlikely. On July 10, 1951, formal armistice negotiations began at Kaesong, later moving to Panmunjom. Delegations included representatives from UNC, the DPRK, and the PRC. Talks progressed slowly due to disagreements on fundamental issues. Demarcation line. UNC proposed a line corresponding to current positions. DPRK/PRC negotiators insisted on roughly the 38th parallel. Prisoner of war repatriation. UNC insisted on voluntary repatriation. DPRK/PRC demanded the forced return of all prisoners. Supervision of the ceasefire. Disagreements arose regarding which nations could serve as monitors. The negotiations frequently stalled. Both sides used limited battlefield operations to influence talks. During this period, the Korean War resembled the static warfare of earlier 20th century conflicts. Front lines remained largely unchanged, but local offensives continued. Major engagements included United States and ROK forces fought to capture a series of hills near the Punchbowl region against entrenched KPA defenders. The battle produced heavy casualties on both sides. Terrain was gained, but offered a limited operational advantage. Following Bloody Ridge, UNC forces assaulted Heartbreak Ridge, a complex of hills held by the KPA. The battle lasted a month and involved extensive use of artillery, infantry assaults, and engineering operations. Despite ultimate UNC success, gains remained tactical rather than strategic. ROK units attacked DPRK positions in the northeast to straighten defensive lines. Terrain captured improved observation and artillery capabilities, but did not alter the broader strategic situation. Across 1951 to 1952, similar engagements, including Hill 266, Old Baldy, Hill 355, Little Gibraltar, and others, reflected a pattern of limited objectives aimed at marginal improvements in defensive posture. Chinese forces adapted to UNC firepower superiority by expanding underground bunker systems, constructing extensive trench networks, building communication tunnels through hills, rotating frontline units to reduce attrition, and increasing use of night resupply. These adjustments increased the difficulty of UNC assaults on fortified terrain. Beginning in mid-1951 and continuing through 1953, air power played a decisive role in shaping the stalemate. The United States 5th Air Force and naval aviation assets conducted interdiction campaigns targeting supply routes, bridges, and railways, close air support for ground operations, strategic bombing of North Korean industrial facilities, and continuous jet combat in MiG Chinese and North Korean air forces operated MiG-15 jet fighters from bases in Manchuria. United States F-86 Sabres engaged them in regular air-to-air combat. Despite numerical disadvantages, UNC forces maintained air superiority. At sea, the United States Navy enforced a blockade of the North Korean coast, disrupting supply shipments, supporting ground operations through naval gunfire, and conducting amphibious feints. Sustained combat in mountainous terrain produced logistical challenges for all sides. Chinese forces relied heavily on manual supply systems due to limited vehicle availability and vulnerability to air attack. UNC forces used extensive truck networks, aerial resupply, and engineering units to maintain fortified positions. Harsh winter conditions repeatedly disrupted movement and inflicted non-combat casualties. The stalemate phase resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties on all sides, combatants and civilians, due to extended trench warfare, artillery bombardment, disease, and exposure. In 1952, the conflict became increasingly influenced by political dynamics. The United States presidential election heightened debates over war aims. The PRC and DPRK remained determined to secure advantageous armistice terms. The Soviet Union, under Stalin, continued to support prolonged negotiations and attrition. Throughout the year, neither side achieved decisive breakthroughs, and negotiations continued to stall primarily over prisoner-of-war repatriation. The broader strategic environment began to shift in March 1953, following the death of Joseph Stalin. The Soviet leadership signaled greater flexibility regarding negotiations, influencing Chinese and DPRK positions. This shift accelerated progress toward an armistice, though fighting continued until the agreement was finalized. When the Korean War began on June 25, 1950, the first military responses beyond the ground fighting occurred in the air. Within hours of the DPRK advance, United States Far East Air Force's aircraft conducted reconnaissance flights over the peninsula. By the following day, aircraft based in Japan began striking routes used by North Korean columns moving towards Seoul. These early sorties targeted bridges, rail hubs, and convoys. As ground units retreated towards Suwon and Taichung during the first week of the war, air support became continuous, and by early July, UNC aircraft were operating over most of southern Korea without opposition. As the Pusan Perimeter formed in August 1950, air operations expanded to cover the entire southeastern region. Aircraft struck DPRK armored formations attempting to cross the Naktong River and interdicted supply movements approaching Taegu. Attack aircraft, flying from bases in Japan and from the carrier USS Valley Forge, operated throughout daylight hours. This continuous pressure reduced the ability of DPRK units to mass forces against a single sector of the perimeter. Night operations remained limited due to equipment constraints, but daytime strikes restricted movement to such an extent that DPRK units were forced to rely increasingly on concealed routes. During the same period, naval operations supported the defense of the perimeter. Surface vessels patrolled the southern and eastern coasts, providing artillery fire against DPRK positions near Pohang, Masan, and other coastal areas. Transport ships carried reinforcements and supplies from Japan, enabling the buildup that stabilized the perimeter by early September. Minesweeping operations, begun in July, cleared approaches for later amphibious landings. Following the Inchon Landing on September 15, 1950, naval forces provided sustained bombardment as X-Corps advanced towards Seoul. Once the capital was retaken on September 25th, engineers restored basic functions of the port, allowing ships to unload cargo in support of the next phase of operations. Airfields near Kimpo and Suwon were repaired by early October, enabling FEAF to operate directly from Korea rather than Japan. As ground forces crossed the 38th parallel in early October, air operations shifted northward, targeting retreating DPRK units and supply routes between Pyongyang and the Yalu. After the capture of Pyongyang on October 19, 1950, UNC aircraft continued reconnaissance flights toward the Yalu River. These flights observed increased activity along the northern border, but did not identify large-scale Chinese troop movements due to nighttime crossings and concealment. As 8th Army advanced toward the Changchun River, and X-Corps moved inland from Wonsan, air operations attempted to disrupt remaining DPRK movements while also supporting engineers constructing roads and airstrips. When Chinese forces entered the war in late October, air combat changed significantly. On November 1, 1950, MiG-15 jets engaged FEF aircraft near the Yalu River, marking the beginning of jet combat in Korea. The initial United States aircraft, primarily F-80 Shooting Stars and F-51 Mustangs, were less capable at high altitudes. The introduction of the F-86 Sabre in December restored the United States' competitiveness, but MiG activity restricted the depth of interdiction near the Yalu. During the Chinese first phase offensive, air operations focused on identifying new troop movements and providing support to units near Unsan and Anjou. Difficult terrain and adverse weather limited reconnaissance effectiveness. As Chinese forces withdrew after early November engagements, aircraft resumed strikes against supply routes north of Pyongyang. During the Chinese Second Phase Offensive in late November 1950, air operations supported the withdrawal of 8th Army across the Chosin River and the withdrawal of X-Corps toward the Chosin Reservoir. Transport aircraft conducted airdrops to isolated units, while fighter aircraft covered withdrawal routes. The evacuation of Hungnam in December required continuous naval gunfire and air cover. Between 12 to 24 December 1950, ships loaded over 100,000 troops, equipment, and civilians while aircraft patrolled the harbor and attacked Chinese units approaching from inland. After the UNC forces withdrew to positions south of Seoul in January 1951, logistical operations increased dramatically. Supplies moved from Pusan to Seoul via repaired rail lines, and from Seoul to the front by truck convoys. Air transport supplemented ground movement during periods of severe winter weather. As ground forces stabilized the front and conducted limited counteroffensives during January, March 1951, air operations shifted to close support along the Han River and interdiction north of the 38th parallel. When armistice negotiations began in July 1951, air operations retained a central role. Although the front line remained largely stable, continuous artillery exchanges and limited attacks on fortified positions required persistent air support. Aircraft struck supply routes leading from the Yalu to central Korea, including rail junctions near Sinuiju, Ganggi, and Huakon. Bridges repeatedly destroyed by bombing were repaired at night by Chinese workers, requiring repeated attacks. Naval forces continued the blockades initiated in 1950. Destroyers shelled coastal positions near Wonsan and Songjin, disrupting Chinese movements along the East Coast Highway. Minesweeping ships maintained access to East Coast harbors used by UNC, while carrier-based aircraft conducted strikes on transportation networks throughout 1951 and 1952. As the stalemate continued into 1952, UNC intensified interdiction efforts. Airstrikes targeted hydroelectric facilities along the Yalu River, including the Sueho Dam, reducing North Korea's generating capacity. Although these attacks did not halt CPV operations, they reduced industrial output and limited the ability to repair damaged infrastructure. Jet combat increased during this period, with F-86 Sabres and MiG-15s engaging frequently near the northern boundary of UNC air operations. Throughout 1952, logistics sustained one of the largest continuous supply operations of the post-World War II era. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, fuel, and winter clothing moved through Pusan, up the Central Rail Line, and to numerous depots south of the front. Helicopters, used increasingly from 1951 onward, transported wounded personnel from frontline positions to mobile surgical hospitals. Truck convoys operated daily, adapting to rough terrain and weather that frequently disrupted movement. By early 1953, logistical improvements allowed UNC forces to maintain stable frontline positions despite continuous small-scale fighting. Air operations increased in frequency to pressure Chinese negotiators. Naval forces continued blockade duties and conducted bombardments along the East Coast in support of ROK ground operations. Through each phase of the war, the actions beyond the trenches directly shaped events on the ground. Air superiority restricted enemy mobility and provided consistent support to frontline troops. Naval control protected sea lanes, enabled amphibious operations, and conducted major evacuations. Logistics allowed UNC forces to sustain prolonged combat and withstand harsh winter conditions. After the UNC forces recaptured Seoul on March 14, 1951, and stabilized the front during the operations, both sides began to signal an interest in formal discussions to end large-scale hostilities. While local battles continued through the spring, diplomatic exchanges between UNC and communist representatives progressed. On June 23, 1951, the Soviet diplomat Jacob Malik delivered a public statement proposing negotiations for a ceasefire in Korea. This announcement marked the first formal step toward armistice talks and reflected the recognition that neither side could achieve a decisive victory through continued offensive operations. Following preliminary communications, both sides agreed to meet on July 10, 1951. The first session took place at Kaesong, then held by the Communist forces. Representatives from UNC, the Korean People's Army, KPA, and the Chinese People's Volunteers, CPV, attended. The opening sessions focused on establishing procedures, agenda items, and security arrangements. Discussions during July and August addressed basic principles for a ceasefire, including the requirement that both sides halt operations once an agreement was reached and that military commanders oversee implementation. Negotiations soon encountered difficulties. Disputes over the location of further meetings interrupted progress, as UNC representatives cited concerns about security violations near Kaesong. On August 23, 1951, UNC delegates suspended talks after incidents involving armed personnel near the negotiation site. Following further exchanges, both sides agreed to move negotiations to Panmunjom, a small village located near the eventual line of contact, and meetings resumed there on October 25, 1951. When discussions restarted, the central issue became the military demarcation line, the boundary that would separate forces during and after the armistice. UNC negotiators proposed a line based on the current positions held by both sides, reflecting gains made during operations in early 1951. CPV and KPA representatives argued for the 38th parallel as the appropriate boundary. Throughout November and December, discussions continued without resolution as both sides defended their positions. During the same period, ground forces engaged in limited operations to improve local tactical positions, attempting to influence the negotiations. On November 27, 1951, the delegations reached an agreement on the principle that the military demarcation line would follow the existing line of contact. Mapping the precise location of the line required extensive review of frontline positions, which changed frequently due to small-scale engagements. Survey teams produced detailed charts of the terrain, identifying ridgelines, road junctions, and river crossings to define a stable boundary. By January 1952, negotiators turned to the next major issue: supervision of the armistice. UNC proposed that neutral nations oversee the administrative mechanisms, while CPV and KPA delegates insisted on broader roles for communist-aligned states. Discussions continued for months, with debates covering airfield restrictions, troop rotation policies, and the size of inspection teams. Despite sustained exchanges, limited progress occurred between February and May 1952. The most complex issue emerged in spring 1952, the question of prisoner of war repatriation. UNC policy required voluntary repatriation, allowing prisoners to choose whether to return to DPRK or PRC control. Communist negotiators demanded mandatory repatriation of all prisoners, regardless of individual preference. This issue became the primary obstacle to concluding the armistice for more than a year. Concurrent with these negotiations, fighting continued along the front. Engagements at Old Baldy, White Horse Hill, and the Jamestown line reflected attempts by both sides to improve their tactical posture. These battles affected the discussions indirectly by demonstrating the cost of prolonged conflict and the difficulty of altering frontline positions through local attacks. In October 1952, UNC forces conducted air operations targeting North Korean power facilities along the Yalu River, including the Sueho hydroelectric plant. These strikes reduced electrical output in North Korea and added pressure to the ongoing negotiations. At the same time, Chinese and DPRK forces reinforced defensive lines to prepare for possible ground offensives. Despite increased military activity, no major shift occurred at the negotiation table, as the prisoner issue remained unresolved. Throughout late 1952, political developments outside Korea influenced the progress of talks. In the United States, the presidential election brought Dwight D. Eisenhower to office. After his inauguration on January 20th, 1953, Eisenhower examined the Korean situation and reaffirmed support for voluntary repatriation. His administration also reviewed options to increase military pressure if negotiations remained stalled. A major turning point came with the death of Joseph Stalin on March 5, 1953. Stalin's passing altered the strategic outlook in Moscow, and the Soviet leadership expressed a greater willingness to reduce tensions in Korea. Communications between Beijing, Pyongyang, and Moscow reflected a shift toward concluding the armistice. Within weeks, PRC and DPRK negotiators signaled increased flexibility on the prisoner issue. In April 1953, both sides agreed to a Neutral Nations Repatriation Commission, an NRC, composed of representatives from Sweden, Switzerland, India, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. The commission would supervise the handling of prisoners who refused repatriation, holding them in neutral custody until final decisions were reached. This agreement removed the central barrier that had stalled negotiations for nearly a year. With the prisoner issue addressed, the remaining matters were resolved more quickly. Negotiators finalized the armistice procedures, including requirements for cessation of hostilities, creation of a demilitarized zone (DMZ), mechanisms for the Military Armistice Commission (MAC), provisions for civilian and military exchanges. During June and early July 1953, fighting increased along the front as both sides sought minor tactical gains before the armistice took effect. Chinese forces launched significant attacks at the Kumsong salient in early July, achieving limited advances. These actions did not alter the broader strategic picture. On July 27, 1953, representatives of the UNC, the Korean People's Army, and the Chinese People's Volunteers signed the Korean Armistice Agreement at Panmunjom. The agreement established a military demarcation line reflecting the final positions of both sides, a demilitarized zone approximately 4 kilometers wide. Procedures for prisoner exchange, Operation Big Switch. Supervisory mechanisms through the MAC and the NNRC. The signing ended active hostilities but did not constitute a formal peace treaty. Military forces from both sides remained positioned near the DMZ, and political negotiations concerning the future of the peninsula continued in the years after the armistice. On July 27, 1953, after 2 years of negotiations and continued ground fighting, representatives of the United Nations Command, UNC, the Korean People's Army, KPA, and the Chinese People's Volunteers, CPV, signed the Korean Armistice Agreement at Panmunjom. This agreement marked the formal end of active hostilities on the Korean peninsula, although it did not constitute a peace treaty. The signing followed several weeks of intensified military operations as both sides attempted to improve their tactical positions before the ceasefire took effect. The armistice, implemented at 2,200 hours local time on the same day, immediately halted all offensive operations. Artillery exchanges, infantry assaults, and air strikes that had continued up to the final hours ceased once the ceasefire clock reached its effective moment. Frontline commanders on both sides issued orders to freeze positions along the line of contact, establishing the boundary that would define the Military Demarcation Line, MDL. Following the signing, implementing the agreement required coordinated military procedures. Joint observation teams, composed of personnel from neutral nations and representatives from the signatory commands, moved to designated locations to verify the cessation of hostilities. Survey teams marked the MDL with reference points, beginning a process that lasted several weeks as both sides produced accurate maps of the final line. This work established the basis for the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, a buffer measuring approximately 4 kilometers wide, centered on the MDL. In the days immediately after the ceasefire, both sides repositioned units away from the MDL to comply with the requirements of the agreement. Trenches, outposts, and defensive works that had been built close to combat lines were abandoned or moved south or north, depending on their position relative to the new zone. Engineering units constructed fences, watchtowers, and barriers along portions of the DMZ, and mine clearing began in selected areas to create monitored zones accessible for inspection by the supervising commissions. One of the first major undertakings after the armistice was the exchange of prisoners of war. Before the signing, each side had prepared lists of personnel held in captivity. Operation Big Switch, the primary exchange mechanism, began in August 1953. Earlier, in May 1953, a partial exchange known as Operation Little Switch had returned wounded and sick prisoners to each side. Big Switch handled the bulk of the remaining prisoners. Under the terms of the armistice, prisoners who refused repatriation were placed under the authority of the Neutral Nations Repatriation Commission, NNRC, composed of representatives from Sweden, Switzerland, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and India. These individuals remained in neutral custody until final determinations were completed later in the year. Many prisoners from Chinese and North Korean forces declined repatriation, and their cases required extended review. By the end of 1953, most prisoner cases were resolved, although administrative processes continued into early 1954. While the armistice halted fighting, military forces on both sides remained substantial. The UNC maintained units along the southern boundary of the DMZ, supported by air and naval forces in the region. ROK forces, under expanded training and reorganization programs, strengthened their positions and increased defensive readiness. On the northern side, CPV and KPA units also remained deployed near the DMZ, constructing new defensive positions north of the buffer zone. Although large-scale offensives ceased, both sides continued surveillance, patrols, and fortification activities. Casualty reporting and assessments of losses began in the months after the armistice. Estimates compiled by various governments and military organizations reflected the scale of the conflict. Military deaths on all sides totaled approximately 2 to 3 million, with civilian casualties significantly higher. Entire towns and villages across the peninsula had been destroyed or severely damaged. Transportation systems, including rail lines, bridges, and roads, required extensive reconstruction. Industrial plants in North Korea, heavily targeted during bombing campaigns, had sustained significant damage. In August and September 1953, UNC forces began modifying their deployments to reflect the end of active combat. Rotations previously postponed due to frontline requirements resumed. United States units reduced some forward positions but retained significant troop levels in Korea. ROK forces continued expanding and reorganizing, supported by United States military assistance programs. In North Korea, reconstruction efforts began in Pyongyang, Hamhung, Wonsan, and other cities impacted by bombing. Chinese forces also prepared for phased withdrawals, although Chinese units remained in Korea into 1958. Pyongyang coordinated reconstruction with assistance from the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. Diplomatic developments after the armistice focused on the possibility of a political conference to address the long-term future of the peninsula. The armistice called for such a conference to begin within 3 months. Discussions commenced in Geneva in April 1954, involving delegates from the UNC, the DPRK, the PRC, and other participating nations. These talks failed to produce an agreement regarding Korean unification or a formal peace treaty. As a result, the armistice remained the governing document for military relations across the peninsula. Throughout late 1953 and into early 1954, both sides activated the Military Armistice Commission, MAC, as specified in the agreement. The MAC met regularly at Panmunjom to resolve disputes concerning patrol activity, DMZ violations, prisoner issues, and the conduct of military personnel near the boundary. These meetings established the administrative framework that continues to regulate military interactions between the two Koreas. During the months following the armistice, the United States and the Republic of Korea signed a mutual defense treaty on October 1, 1953. This agreement formalized the security relationship between the two countries and committed the United States to assist South Korea in case of renewed aggression. The treaty also institutionalized the long-term presence of United States forces on the peninsula. By late 1953, reconstruction in South Korea progressed through programs supported by the United Nations Korean Reconstruction Agency, UNKRA. Projects included rebuilding roads, bridges, schools, and medical facilities. Food assistance and economic stabilization programs addressed shortages created by the war. The ROK government, led by Syngman Rhee, focused on restoring administrative control and reorganizing internal security forces. In North Korea, the scale of wartime destruction necessitated extensive rebuilding. Rail lines north of Pyongyang were repaired first to restore supply links with Manchuria. Reconstruction efforts focused on industrial centers, housing, and basic infrastructure. Chinese and Soviet advisors assisted in rebuilding factories, power stations, and transportation networks. Although precise timelines varied by region, significant reconstruction activities continued throughout the mid-1950s. The immediate aftermath of the war also involved addressing the humanitarian impact. Both Koreas faced large displaced populations requiring resettlement. In South Korea, refugee centers continued to operate, and international organizations provided assistance. In North Korea, displaced civilians returned to destroyed or heavily damaged towns, requiring organized state-led rebuilding programs. As 1953 concluded, the Korean peninsula remained divided along the military demarcation line established at the armistice. The DMZ, monitored by both sides, functioned as a buffer preventing renewed large-scale conflict. No peace treaty followed, and the political situation surrounding the peninsula remained unresolved.